Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio. This is episode 53, in which we talk about game design in academia. Talking today we have
Tom Betts,
Leif Foged, Michael Cook,
Ian Horswill, and
Darren Grey. Now, invited you all on here to talk about how the world of academia, sort of in universities and research departments at universities around the world, there is quite serious research going on in game design, and in particular, in a lot of the stuff I've seen, there's a lot of stuff in procedural content and AI, which is very relevant to the sphere of roguelikes. Just to go through you all and check about your own sort of backgrounds and experiences. Tom, what's your background?
Well, I did teach. I lectured on a BA games design course for about 7 years, and I'm partway through a PhD. But my background is totally non-programming and non-computer science. I graduated from an arts college, and I'm kind of a self-taught programmer. So my angle on things is often a bit more arty than, say, industry. But in the last few years, I stopped teaching, and I've been working for a small company called Big Robot, making games, and quite a lot of the stuff we do is procedural based.
What's your PhD in?
Well, it's in the School of Art, but it's looking at the notion of the sublime in games, but looking at the sublime as a result of kind of permutations and infinity, and sort of that philosophical aspect of it. It relates back to Kant. It's quite a sort of arty take on what you can do within games, but with a sort of mathematical edge to it.
That sounds very interesting. I'll have to look at some of the stuff you worked on, because I've got quite an interest in that stuff myself. Michael, what about yourself?
I'm 2 years into a PhD now at Imperial College in London, where I'm working on automated game design. So we're really looking at building software that can design games without any humans in them, getting involved in the process. So I've been working on a piece of software called ANGELINA, and we've been looking at building level designers, but at the same time, trying to get the software to do other tasks simultaneously. And some of the latest work is sort of looking at inventing game concepts or game mechanics, and maybe even elements of RPGs, classes, skill trees, things like that. But to try and do them without as little human involvement as possible. So it's quite a weird take from a design perspective, I guess. But it slots quite well into procedural content generation as a whole.
Very nice. And Ian, yourself?
I originally trained in robotics, so I did a thesis on mobile robotics, which basically means making robots not run into things. That was largely what my thesis work was on. And then I went to Northwestern University to teach, and I ran a art and technology program for several years, and now I'm doing research on interactive entertainment. A lot of my interest is in virtual characters for narrative, which is rather different from roguelikes, but then Leif and I started doing some work with Constraint Propagation, which is interesting for roguelikes.
Leif, so you're involved in the same work as Ian, are you?
Right. I'm an undergrad at Northwestern University. I'm a computer science major, and I guess a lot of my interests over the past several years have been sort of broadly in, of course, making games, but also in thinking about how do we make games personal and adaptable and things like that. And that sort of led me into some of the latest work that I've done with Ian about some cool applications of constraint technology to roguelikes.
Okay. When you say constraint propagation, do you mind explaining what you mean by that?
I guess it's sort of a broad technique that allows you to solve a useful class of problems really, really fast. The technical details are perhaps a little messy. Ian, what would you say?
I think so. Constraint propagation is a particular approach to doing what are called declarative representations or declarative programming. And so the idea is that rather than specifying in detail a procedure for constructing the answer to some problem. You instead try and describe what an answer would look like and leave it to the system to figure out how to find the answer based on the description of what the answer would look like.
I think that sums it up really well, and I think one of the larger goals is a lot of the times whenever people are doing procedural content generation in games, they're writing a lot of little custom algorithms to do a lot of really small tasks that they want to be done procedurally. And it'd be really great if that were a much more efficient process, if they were more in the business of describing what they want rather than how to do it.
I'm just trying to sort of get my head around that. So would this be used for sort of creating levels and puzzles and sort of very integrated levels with problems that must be overcome?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly the kind of thing it gets used for.
So it's essentially creating an AI to make the level for you, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Just checking out. I'm getting that properly. I should know. I work in academia myself, but as a sort of operations guy in energy research. So I'm frequently having to try and figure out what the academics mean in plain English. I'm just trying to do that here, if that's okay. I mean, I first came in contact with some of the proper academic stuff that's involved in game design with a paper by, I don't know which university it's from, but I know Julian Togelius was one of the co-authors on it. It was a procedural level generator was the title of the paper, and it was about making a generator that can generate. Well, you can probably guess, but it's procedural content generation. But this was done as an academic paper, and I'm used to seeing academic papers, but it's weird to see an academic paper that talks about PCG in Mario and PCG in Rogue and all these other things that you're not used to seeing discussed seriously in an academic paper with lots of references and so on. But there is a serious amount of work going on in quite a lot of universities, and I think it's been taken much more seriously these days than probably would have done in the past. Would you guys say that? I'm not. You guys probably.
Yes, absolutely.
You guys are probably more clued in with the industry in general, but I mean, just as games in general are being taken more seriously, game design is becoming much more of a serious thing, and as such, this sort of academic aspect of it is also sort of gaining much more weight.
Yeah, I'd also say that there's an increasing crossover between what you might consider useful research into games design that can also support a lot of other sort of associated areas. So there's a lot of people doing research into procedural modelling of say cities and distribution, road networks, and all that kind of stuff. And those have more applications than just games. So I think that there's a sort of crossover that's also helping sort of encourage that research in those sort of areas.
I think one of the reasons why that's happened is because a lot of people have wanted to pursue a particular area, but they've had to sort of adjust the applications that they've made and the proposals that they've made so that they intersect with other areas of research. But that's been beneficial because it's meant that we've realised that there are actually applications of solutions to these problems like generating a level in Rogue. You might actually find that they have applications in unexpected domains, which is really great because it means you've got a great excuse to produce a cool piece of technology. And also you've got a happy ending for people who don't necessarily play games.
Plus, it can sometimes wrap around a little bit. They're at the Roguelike Development Conference held at Imperial in June. There was a guy from an architecture firm talking about how they use procedural techniques in architecture to produce structurally integral buildings and to design the spaces and things within buildings. And it was proper procedure. This wasn't just copy pasting different things. It was considering the physics of the situation, considering the flow of people in certain situations, and it was all very, very similar to how we do things in games. And there was also stuff to be learned from this. It went into a level of complexity that you normally wouldn't go into in games, in properly considering how people move about and such. And there's a lot of sort of reflection back on that and how we can use that in games. So I think some of these other applications can really bring back new ideas into games as well.
Definitely. I mean, I think you're right. But architects have been using kind of what they sort of call parametric-based modeling for a long time to produce, the kind of cutting-edge buildings that you're seeing sort of coming up all over the place. And similarly, because a lot of contemporary film use vast amounts of CGI, they're really invested in having procedural content work for them as well. Because if they want to do a flyover in a film of a city or a canyon or anything like that, they don't really want someone to have to model every single boulder or every single brick. So there's a lot of crossover there, and that the technologies are applicable to that too. And probably more that we just can't, on the tip of our tongues, not right in a minute, but I'm sure there's a lot more.
The architecture was the one that interested me the most, because this is procedurally designing something to be used, not something just to be looked at, but to actually be used. And that's what we do with game making. We design it for someone to experience. So I haven't seen any of the stuff with procedurally generating roads, but I imagine that would have some interesting stuff of relevance as well, because again, that's considering how to give an experience to someone, and considering the vehicles and how traffic intersects and things like that. So I imagine there'd be similar stuff in that would be of interest to game makers.
Definitely. It's interesting that you noted that it was a level of complexity that you didn't often see in games, and obviously that's one of the benefits of the sort of the freedom that academia provides, is that once you've got the funding, you've kind of got free rein to investigate whatever questions you want without worrying about profit. Of course, the other side of that coin is that it often leads many of us to sort of go down rabbit holes from which there is no return, and we sort of don't really produce anything useful. But it's a balance. Occasionally you get stuff that wouldn't have been feasible for a developer to pursue themselves.
It's interesting in academia in general, there is this problem of academics working on something that interests them, but might not be of any use to the real world at all. But still, it could be interesting stuff, and you get what's called blue sky research of stuff being done for the sake of the science, and every now and then you get something that could never have been done if you hadn't been doing it in this way. I think possibly that could be in game design similar things. Although, interesting, game design, I would think, has more of a practical edge to it, game design research, than other forms of research, because you ultimately want to make a game, as in something playable. It's the whole idea of game design is to have something practical on the other side.
I think that one of the issues about the academic research kind of process is that, to be honest, in a lot of cases, people just want to get published. And I think Ian Bogost said something like, the main priority for most academic research is publishing. It's not necessarily, in some cases, what the actual research is, or the product, or the area even. It's just getting the published paper, so therefore you can get the points. And that's a requirement, really, of working in that environment. So you will get things that are pushed through and published, which don't really have a great, benefit to the community, because they're there just for the sake of the points. Which can, unfortunately, I think, can kind of water stuff down and sort of throws you off from the stuff that is good.
Yes, too true.
So, that's sad. Okay.
Yeah, it's to do with they're both. If you're a developer, then obviously you have to obtain your funding in some way, and that means that your game has to have some level of commercial considerations. So when you're designing your game, no matter how interesting and abstract or crazy you would like it to be, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, you have to rein in some of those experimental tendencies and some of that R&D that you might do, because you're aware that at the end of the day you need to sell the product. And similarly, in an academic environment, there are certain kind of requirements of the rigor and the publishing framework and all those kind of aspects that will dictate the way you go about your work there as well. So it's not just limited to one environment. I mean, it would be great if we could all just explore exactly what we wanted to do and get funding for it, but in neither of those two environments is that likely to happen.
So just to check then, how many of you have actually sort of produced like real games that are out there to be played?
So Angelina, from day one, I wanted to make sure that whatever its output was, whatever dubious quality it had, it was playable. So it's produced some simple arcade games, a very small number of rather crappy platformers, and this December, hopefully, we're going to be releasing something else that demonstrates some of the latest research results. So there are playable examples out there, but I think, like Tom said, because profit is not a consideration here. Making the money to pay my rent is not a consideration. Obviously, these games are not commercial quality, and that's something that's hard to shake off.
Well, you're on Roguelike Radio here. We don't really make things of commercial quality here. Well, it's probably worth noting for the audience members that haven't heard of it before. Can you describe Angelina?
Yeah.
Without trying to sound like a doting father.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I've managed to tone it down. Angelina's a kind of multi-modular AI program. And it attempts, it's sort of lots of different tiny game design modules that work together to produce a game. So for the platform games, you might have a module that designs the levels, a module that designs some power-ups or mechanics, and a module that places the player and enemies in the game world. And those modules will cooperate and talk to each other and sort of collaborate on a final design. And we've done that in a couple of genres, and we add new modules and pursue ideas about what is actually going on between these modules. What happens when a designer sits down and tries to design a level that suits a mechanic, or when he tries to design a visual style that suits a theme. What's actually going on there when those two modules interact? So that's sort of the focus of that research. We were going off at a tangent. We were going to list what playable output people had produced.
Okay. Well, I've produced a kind of sort of generative audio sequencer puzzle game that's on Steam at the minute. It's partly came out of my research, but I modified it quite a lot. At first, it was shown in art galleries, and it had no interface and no kind of guidance whatsoever, so it was pretty confusing, but it was right for that environment. But I put front end on it, the GUI, and sort of made it a little bit more intuitive, and that's available on Steam. I released a free game called In Ruins, which is very close to roguelikes, and I actually used a variation of, I think it's called the D20 generation system, so sort of room corridor based thing, but it translates that into 3 dimensions, and you can explore. It's got a very, very simple mechanic in that. And at the minute, I'm working on a game called Sir, You're Being Hunted, which is just on Kickstarter now, and it looks like we're going to hit our target in the next sort of day or so, which is brilliant. And that's an open world sort of stealth-based game, but all the terrain in it, and effectively most of the game, I guess, because of that, is procedurally generated.
What's been your role on Sir, You're Being Hunted?
I'm the programmer.
Okay, so you're the one doing all this procedural magic.
Yeah.
Just worth noting, In Ruins, for those that haven't played it, is it's probably the best example I've seen of a 3D roguelike level generator in the way it makes its room and corridor style blocks and rising areas. It's quite nice to explore. If anyone's thinking of ever making a 3D roguelike, definitely check out In Ruins. Should get some nice inspiration from that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was. I let it go out free because the game plan is relatively underdeveloped, and it's more of a kind of, like you say, it's a sort of ambient experience, really, as much as anything else. Just to sort of wander around and sort of enjoy the spaces it creates, I guess.
Is it open source, or what did you make it in?
It was made in Unity. All my work at the minute's in Unity. Just because, again, for commercial kind of reasons, really, it's cross-platform in a lot of ways. It's fast to develop on. It's one of the cheapest development kind of kits out there. And I also did a big job for Channel 4. I produced a game for them, and that was the requirement at the time. So I just kind of ended up using it from then on.
A lot of people are using Unity these days, it seems.
Yeah, it's a good. I think it's. I mean, I hated it when I first started using it because I was from a C++, console programming background. But it's very good for prototyping things. It's quick. It's easy to learn. It's free, and the free version has a lot of functionality. There's not that much more that you need in the kind of full version. So it's really good, and it's a kind of mixture of both the sort of coding environment and a sort of more 3D modeling kind of IDE. So it's good.
Leif, sorry, have you released any games?
Yeah, well, one of the big motivations behind the work I was doing with Ian was I was working on a dungeon crawler called Trial by Spire with a couple friends of mine, and we really wanted to explore what could be done there in terms of procedural content generation, creating an adaptive experience, things like that. And so that was sort of our primary motivation, or my primary motivation for the work I did with Ian.
So, can you describe that a little bit?
Sure. It's just it's sort of the simplest tech demo we could get out the door, and it's sort of you go through level to level to level and fight a bunch of enemies, level up, cast a bunch of cool spells, things like that.
Okay. And this is what you use the constraint propagation sort of methodology in?
Right.
I'll just come back to you in a second then just to talk about that, if that's okay.
Sure.
Ian, have you produced any games yourself?
Not really, and that's partly because my research interest is more in terms of interactive characters and narrative and so on. So my goals are in many ways more toward like trying to make the equivalent of experimental film. But I have students who've made games, but partly because of the slight difference in research interest, and also partly because faculty don't have a lot of time to actually make games. I take that back. I did make one game that I use to teach what's called our data structures course, called Happy Fun Blob, which is a soft body physics platformer where you're an amoeba that's jumping around from platform to platform. But there's nothing interesting in it from a game design standpoint. It's made to have eye candy and to be a somewhat more interesting environment to explore some of the computer science issues that the students need to learn in the class.
Okay. Just going back to the constraint propagation thing, you guys released a paper on it at, what was it, AIIDE?
Yes, Artificial Intelligence and Interactive Digital Entertainment Conference.
Right, I will include a link to that on the blog post for this. But do you want to talk a little bit about the paper you produced and some of the results that came out of that?
Yeah, the first thing I would say about the paper is that the paper was written for a very academic audience, and one of the things on my to-do list is to write a completely different version of it that is intended for people who are less in love with Greek letters, because there are quite a lot of Greek letters in the paper, and the Greek letters really are not important to understanding the concepts of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just read it actually a couple of days ago. I think Michael forwarded it to me, and it's really interesting what you're doing with it. But I agree, when it got to the Greek letters, I was stuck, and I program all day, and I was like, I don't know what any of that means.
It's an interesting problem. I've been told by academics that you should always have one slide in every presentation that you're sure the audience won't understand, just so you sort of shock them and they think you must know what you're talking about. But at the same time, it's a real problem because, especially in the roguelike genre, you've got a lot of developers who are very savvy, very interested in new ideas, And I think it's a great idea, Ian, about sort of rewriting articles and stuff. I'd love to rewrite some of my papers as well, to be more open and more accessible.
Well, you say in roguelike circles, actually, there's quite a few maths and physics graduates who probably would be reasonably comfortable with these academic papers. At least I found I was reasonably comfortable reading them with a physics background myself. Mm-hmm. But I agree that sort of it spends a lot of time talking about some little details, and at the end, it almost doesn't quite make the point. I was speaking to Michael about it, and some of the things he was telling me, I didn't read in that paper about some of the outcomes of what this constraint propagation threw up, of some interesting tactics that the AIs devised and things. It's kind of, there's a lot of nitty gritty, and then not a lot of bang, I guess you could say.
Right, and in some sense that was a deliberate decision on my part, and Leif, thanks for going along with it. But there's a certain rhetorical problem with writing that paper, which is that, and this is sort of getting back to the issues with academia. In academia, more or less, you tend to get brownie points for coming up with hairy new tech. And the real take-home message of our research in this case was that you didn't need the hairy tech. The simpler tech was sufficient for a lot of what we wanted to do. And so perhaps out of nervousness, I was overcompensating and putting more Greek letters into the paper to make sure that the reviewers didn't think that we were going with the simpler tech because we didn't understand the hairy tech.
Right, okay.
Right. And I mean, given sort of what Ian just said, I think he's right in that coming from the perspective of having no intention of going into academia, I really found sort of the project that we worked on to be a really interesting and personally beneficial experience. And I think sort of the great outcome of that was that we could sort of confidently say this is something that you could build in your own game without doing something super hairy and super technical and super scary.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's often undervalued in the academic process is the actual creative result of research. Because I think sometimes there's a sort of concern over the numbers to say, oh, well, this system's really good because it will execute under this memory footprint, or with reduces file sizes to this, that, and the other. Whereas from a game developer's point of view, we're not necessarily worried about memory footprints as much anymore. We want to know if it makes something that's interesting. And that's maybe a bit harder to kind of quantify and gauge. It's much easier to assess something with a sort of diagnostic sort of mathematical metric on how much permutations it performs with a particular input set. But when I was reading your paper, I was thinking, what would one of these fully populated dungeons look like? How would I experience it as a player? And I think that's something that a lot of academic papers, I don't know if it's just too hard to kind of to grade that or what, but I guess it's coming from an arts background as well. I always want to have a bit more of that in there, see actually creatively what will these things result in.
And I think sort of looking at what industry people care about, more and more the issue I think is the right dimension is something closer to developer hours. And I think that the more declarative methods have some promise there.
I still think that that there are issues though, and I think some of those problems are that a lot of academic research is geared towards what the industry wants, and as Tom says, a lot of the time that is memory footprints, because there are still issues with can I run this on a console, or at AIIDE there was actually a panel of EA Sports. I think they were all AI specialists, I guess, and they were talking about limitations and hardware problems and stuff still, and I think. I've compared in the past the attitudes that scientists can have and the attitudes that indie developers have. And whilst we shouldn't abuse the freedom. One of the things I think that should be a consideration, and that I certainly see in Tom's work and in the constraint propagation for roguelikes, for populating roguelike levels, is that there is a pursuit of what's interesting and not just what might be applicable to large developers. And again, I think that might come back to what we were talking about earlier, and about that there may not always be a direct application of what we're working on right now. We might not know where this technique is actually going to be best used, but it's still worth, it's still worth doing that experiment. It's still worth pursuing that avenue to see if there is something exciting at the end of the tunnel. And of course, indies do that through experimental gameplay, jams and things like that. And there has to be a place for that in science as well.
Ian, you said you worked in robotics.
Yeah.
So you've probably seen in that field how you'll be doing something experimental, and then maybe in 10 years later, it will hit the market, or it will start becoming popular. It will leave academia and get into the private sector.
Yes, although the robotics market is... There's not currently much of a robotics market. That's not a well-developed industry yet, at least not for artificial intelligence-based robots. There's a large industry in industrial robots which don't have much AI in them. I do think that we will see in the game world techniques from academia gradually move into industrial games, and we certainly have seen quite a lot of that already in the graphics world. Now, what we haven't seen as much of is artificial intelligence research making it into games. And I think there's a good reason for that. Chris Hecker has argued that artificial intelligence is different from other branches of computer science in that it's closer to gameplay. And so you simply can't be a game AI researcher and not think about the game design issues and not think about user experience issues. And I think that's actually a real challenge for at least the computer science end of academia right now, because that's very far outside of the worldview of academic computer science research. And it's going to be kind of a long, hard fight to get those kinds of issues considered to be mainstream computer science issues. I think it can be done. I mean, we saw that kind of thing happen with computer-human interaction research, which earlier was not considered to be computer science at all, and then was eventually accepted as being a core part of computer science.
I find a big problem with a lot of approach to AI in game development is that they only consider it for behavior of computer-controlled entities, which, a lot of the time you don't actually want to be that intelligent. You want a sort of artificial dumbness. You want pattern recognition that the player can sort of take advantage of. Whereas AI can be used for much more things. One sort of oft-mentioned one is the AI in Left 4 Dead, the director or whatever it's called in that, which controls the game rather than controls individual entities. And talked as well about AI designing levels or testing levels and things like that, and making sort of enhancing the game content in ways apart from individual entities in the game.
I think that's absolutely fundamental, and I think there's a huge problem in the games industry at the moment, and it starts at gamers and it goes all the way through to developers, and it's that we're dreaming a lot less than we used to. We're asking for a lot less than we used to. I was actually due to talk at the International Roguelike Developers Conference, and I pulled out at the last minute, unfortunately, this year. But my message there was going to be that the roguelike community is a great way to sort of kickstart just crazy dreaming and asking for the moon on a stick again, because one of the things that slows down advances in areas like AI, in my opinion, in particular in game AI, is that people stop asking for stuff. So one of the reasons why there's a lot of research in NPC interaction is because no one's asking why companion AI isn't improving, or why they can't have a personalized story that tailors itself to them, and this sort of thing. Obviously, that doesn't affect academia directly, but it just sort of produces this pressure when people are asking for new and exciting technology, even if it's not feasible. It encourages people to look in these areas. It adds more interest in these areas. Developers are more enthusiastic about developing experimentally. There are always there's sort of this force of money pushing advances in graphics forwards. But AI, I think, needs people to start asking why they can't talk to the monsters for real this time. They need people to make unreasonable requests, I think.
Yeah, I agree. But I think part of the trouble is to do with the kind of the fact that when we're getting genres that are getting far too established. So when you're talking about AI, for instance, people automatically assume that we're talking about AI in a first-person shooter type of environment with X sort of level design, this kind of interaction, and so on. And that's because a lot of particularly console developers are using tools that are reusable and that are applicable across different products or franchise lines. So that's why they stop asking, because they just assume that the next game in the James Bond sequence will be another game of this type, with this type of AI, with this type of interaction, with this type of gameplay. And so it becomes about just refining those individual units of AI or of level generation, just as a kind of product almost that they can then slot into their studio and use to produce the next title. Rather than what you're talking about, which I totally agree, is that in a way almost every game should be a new bespoke idea. But obviously, again, that's sort of asking for the moon, like you say, and the commercial pressures mean that kind of risk is too hard to take. Which is, I guess, one of the reasons why I don't work in a big studio environment. I think it'd drive me a bit mad. Working kind of as a small independent developer, you get to try those things out because there's not as much risk involved.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a great point. And one of the things that's interesting, I mean, I'm not hugely experienced in roguelike, so Darren, you'll probably be able to tell me better than I would. But over the last few years, it feels like people are asking the question, is this game roguelike more often? And you've got introductions to roguelikes on the web, and they've got a section for roguelikes, and then they've got a section for games that they're not actually sure where they lie anymore. And these are more interesting games that are like Spelunky, that appear to disrupt those genre boundaries. And we need more of need even crazier experimentation than that. I mean, Spelunky's fairly tame blend of genres. As Tom says, we need to start really pushing outside.
Yeah, I mean, this is where sort of indie games kind of excel, of making new genres. I mean, another example would be FTL, which some people ask, is it a roguelike? And it's kind of its own thing, really. It's its own type of game. It's got so many kind of unique elements to it. And yeah, simple genre mashing can produce new things, but also just complete thinking outside the box and inventing wholly new systems. There's a lot of unexplored ground to be found. It doesn't take much to find it. Every year we have the 7-day roguelike challenge, where people create all sorts of different roguelikes, and it always amazes me each year. You get a dozen game ideas that no one has ever done before. Ever. Just out of a simple 1-week game jam. Of people throwing together, trying out new things. Just you get these new things cropping up all the time, and it's amazing just how easy it is to step outside the box and find something completely new.
See, the depressing opposite angle from that, and this is from me teaching games design for about 6 or so years, is that is a very, very small percentage of the students out there who want to learn to make games and work in the industry. Most of them just want to make Call of Duty X or GTA X because that's what they've been exposed to, that's what they see.
I think that's how people start off, though, isn't it? I mean, we all kind of started off, I don't know about you guys, but most people who got into game design started off by copying a game that they liked. And it's, you start off like that, and eventually you kind of, alright, you've done that, what new things can you do? And so I think it's perfectly fine to start with that attitude, as long as people can learn to look beyond that. I remember Michael Bro, I think it was, telling me about how when he first got into when he first started with game design, I think the first thing he did was copying a text adventure that he liked, literally copying it, exact word for word. Just recreating the same game. That was his very first game he made, and it was shit. It was terrible. He admits himself, but that was his starting point, and I think a lot of people have not the best of starting points like that. He was telling me about that actually in response to, I don't know if any of you saw, there's an article on Gamma Sutra called "You Cannot Make Games."
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And it's saying, your initial games are shit, therefore you are shit, therefore you cannot make games. And kind of like Michael Bro was making the point of, yes, my initial games were shit, but I kept trying, I came up with new things eventually, and I got good at it. Of course you're not going to start off making a great game, but it's through keeping on trying that we get somewhere in the end.
I don't think it's not even that. It's like a lot of the students I was teaching, they didn't just want to start by copying a game. They wanted to start by copying probably the most complex productions they could find and assume that they could do it themselves, knowing only Photoshop.
There's a problem in the roguelike community, which it's a bit of a dying problem, but it's still there, of people trying to make NetHack but better, and their definition of better being more complex. And there's been numerous failed projects of that sort, of people trying to make the ultimate roguelike, which will have all sorts of numerous interactions and have simulations of muscle mass and all these sort of crazy things. There's always people popping up with these amazing ideas, and then they never get on beyond the engine stage. Yeah, people are very ambitious when they first get into things. There's that phrase, I think it was a Terry Pratchett phrase, universities are great storehouses of knowledge, because students come in knowing everything and leave knowing nothing. So obviously the knowledge is being absorbed by the university. They clearly think they know everything going in, and clearly think they know nothing coming out. So where does it go?
So yeah, I'd be interested. What do any of you guys have any ideas about how we could go about getting these communities to work together in maybe different ways, or in more one-to-one ways, or breaking down some of these boundaries?
Well, one thing I want to ask is the output of academic stuff, is it usually open source?
I think a lot of people would like it to be. I think sometimes there's a time issue. Very, very rarely, I think, there are issues where they can't release it for whatever reason. I know of academics who have worked at, for instance, BioWare on pathfinding research. I know that they can't release their work. And sometimes it's sort of reluctance to do it for time reasons. I mean, I've told people that I'll release aspects of Angelina, and it's just a case of I can't be bothered to look at that code again in order to make it look nice or even passable. But of course, that's a great point, because a lot of roguelikes, they are open source alternatives available, or code for people to filter through.
There's also a situation with quite a lot of academic, really interesting academic content being locked up in journals that you can't really get access to unless you're part of an institution. And
that's a huge problem.
That's really frustrating from the outside, because potentially that could be put to a lot of use. And yet, unless you're signed up to a particular institution, you can't access a lot of that data.
If any of the people listening to this are interested in any of the stuff we've been talking about, Darren, AIDE, A-I-I-D-E, is, I think, open access this year. SIG, Computational Intelligence in Games, that's been open access this year. And also FDG, the Foundations of Digital Games, they have a whole workshop on procedural content generation. And I think, I don't know if they're open access yet, but I think maybe parts of them are. But like Tom says, too much of it is locked away. Far too much of it just never sees the light of day.
I think Digra is open access, isn't it, as well?
Yeah.
All the Digra papers are online. Sorry, go on.
If you can provide me with links to those, I'll include those links in the blog so people can look through. Just for a moment, Andrew Doull just wants to join in.
Hey, how's it going?
All right. We're about 45 minutes in. So
I thought we might be.
But yes, everyone say hello to Andrew.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello there.
There we go. All right. I can't remember what we've all been talking about. But
I think Ian was about to say something about, we were talking about access to academic research, weren't we?
Yeah. So two things. First of all, as far as open access to journals is concerned, I do hope that's the direction that we're moving in. But even if we aren't, people should know that if you're not at a university, you can still get the titles and the authors of the papers just by doing web searches. And then virtually all the time in computer science, much of the time, people will have copies of the papers on their websites. And if they don't, virtually all the time, if you write to them and say, could you just send me a PDF of your paper, they would be happy to do that. At this point, certainly the major professional organizations allow you to freely distribute your own papers. You simply can't freely distribute papers by other people. So that's one issue. As far as open source is concerned, open source, I personally think all academics ought to be writing their stuff open source. Their universities sometimes think otherwise. The truth is that most of the time, if you were to want to start a company to productize some research that you did in computer science, your real intellectual property isn't the crappy code that you wrote for the paper you just published. It's in the heads of you and the other researchers. And for a production version, you're going to want to rewrite it from scratch anyway. So consequently, I think there's no reason not to put things up open source, personally.
Have any of you guys looked at the procedural content generation wiki?
Yeah. That's you, Andrew, isn't it?
Yes. Well, when you say that's me, I started the PCG wiki 5 years ago now. After I wrote the quite modestly titled Death of the Level Designer series of articles on procedural generation, and kind of went, well, there's no real place on the internet that collects together, even just a taxonomy of what PCG is and a collection of, a list of all the algorithms of what I believe, procedural content generation as opposed to just procedural generation. The Wikipedia article on procedural generation never really made a distinction between the kinds of stuff that I was interested in and the, what you might think of as little p procedural generation, things like procedural textures and procedural animation and stuff. Of course, I've become quite a bit more sophisticated in my thinking since then, and I recognise they're all parts of the same kind of continuum of procedural generation. But and the wiki's kind of slowly updating to reflect that. And unfortunately, there's always a need for more people to spend time contributing to the wiki itself to try and expand on the ideas that I've kind of sketched out there.
I'm wondering about if there should be a section in the wiki listing relevant papers of interest, because there's a lot of papers out there, but probably a lot of people aren't aware of them all.
If you go to the papers drop down at the top of the wiki page, there's a start on that particular.
Well, I'm wondering if all of our listeners should go check it out and maybe add more if they know some.
I wasn't sure on the correct approach here because I basically started off with Julian Tegelius's and etc. And I'm sure there's other people in contributing the papers whose names I'm not familiar with, but he wrote a kind of overview of procedural content generation another taxonomy style approach, and then I started with that paper, added in all references to that paper, and sort of kept iterating till I got bored. And because again, academics tend to reference each other, and then I kind of got a bit worried about the fact that things like the references in a paper might be copyrighted, and so compiling a list out of those kinds of lists might be skirting things that may not be permitted to do or frowned upon in academia. So
I think all academics would love more people knowing about their paper titles.
But it could be useful to have not just lists, but maybe a short sentence or two from people who have read them to say this is useful for this, this, and this, so that if you're looking over the list, you can at least, because a lot of the time the title of the paper doesn't actually make sense, or it doesn't jump out at you why this is of interest. Like the fast procedural level population with playability constraints. The interesting things that come out of that aren't entirely obvious from that title. Yeah, I think perhaps some work on the community, the sort of procedural generation community, to categorize these things, or to put in some notes saying, check this out, it's rather useful, or such like, could be quite handy.
Yeah, that very much comes down to, get on the wiki and contribute, please.
All right.
There's so much more that can be done there. It's just a matter of I'm pretty stretched thin already in terms of my time, but it's a resource that's proven to be surprisingly useful and well visited, and lots of people keep referring to it. I think if I'll just have a quick look, I think it's getting about 200 hits a day thereabouts. Let me just double check that. So it's people are on there all the time. It's referenced from places like Stack Overflow and everything else. So it's proven its utility, at least for an overview. It's kind of missing things like specific implementations of algorithms. It's not comprehensive by any means, but it's certainly a start. And,
I think one of the things which is a shame, this is more probably from the indie development community than the kind of commercial one, because a lot of big studios will have a dedicated AI programmer or team even, and they're much more likely to be hooked into what the latest papers are. But a lot of the kind of more independent developers are almost frightened of looking to academic research, because they don't necessarily think that they're perhaps worthy of it, or they think it's a bit too wordy, or the jargon confuses them, or they come from a background where they're much more used to like checking out code snippets on Flip Code or GameDev.net or all those other types of sites. And I think that's a shame, because there's a lot of really good stuff in some of these papers and in a lot of the academic research that, because of just the difference in cultures, they don't necessarily get access to. I don't really know how you can fix that.
I think it's difficult. I think there's a big gap. I know I've talked to you, Tom, about it. I know Darren's got some thoughts about it as well. I think there's a gap that we could properly bridge between small scale development and academia. Maybe we need more events. I don't know. Maybe we need more sites like the Procedural Content Generation Wiki. I sent you, Darren, a paper about just before we started the podcast about discovering new types of RPG classes. And that kind of thing would be ideal for a roguelike. And I bet there are lots of developers who would be really excited about this system that could go through your game and invent new classes for your players to choose from that had interesting and quirky features. But that paper's locked away somewhere, and it looks a bit obscure. And I think, like Tom said, there might be this feeling that academia doesn't produce things that developers can use. It just produces ideas that loop back on themselves. And maybe we need more events or more collaboration. I don't know.
I think a lot of it is down to language, and you look at an academic paper and it looks very different from the sort of thing that an indie developer is used to looking at. If you were to take some of the same contents, strip it down a little and rephrase it as a blog post, suddenly it would get shared around a lot.
Have any of you guys worked with AIGameDev.com? That's it's a site dedicated to game AI, obviously, but it kind of, I think, attempts to do this cross-pollination between academia and game developers from an AI perspective. And, it's actually commercially self-sustaining now. I think the guy who set it up set it up around the same time as I got the PCG wiki up and running, and he's now, I believe, making a full-time living from running that particular site.
Is it Alex Champagnard or something? He used to hang around on the Flipcode forums and stuff. He's a really good guy, and it does do, like you say, they've got articles on there from like academics, and then to the level designer on Frozen Synapse, which is like a really small indie game that uses procedural content generation. So I think you're right, it's got that really nice spread. The thing that puts me off with that site is that it isn't, it's you have to pay to get access to most of the content. So again, that's the sort of thing that's going to shut doors on the really low level kind of indie developers who aren't going to, they think, why should I pay for this? I don't exactly know what I'm getting out of it, and so on.
There's another problem with that site, or at least a perceived problem from my perspective, is that it's very obsessed with industry applications as much as possible, and maybe it doesn't have the sort of boundless enthusiasm and exploration that you get with some aspects of indie development and some aspects of academia. We do need sites like AI Game Dev, but I think we also need more informal interactions. We need things like the procedural content generation wiki. I'm just looking at it now, and I feel like I'd actually like to sit down and try and touch bits of it up and contribute papers and things like that if I could. Maybe we need things which are less prescriptive. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a hard balance to take. I mean, you kind of want to describe, when you're working on the wiki, you kind of want to describe stuff to an extent that is, comprehensive and reasonably stylistically quite, I guess, formal is the right way to put it. But at the same time, you need people just able to feel like they can contribute straight away. And that, to me, is why I think Stack Overflow is so successful, because it's got that community vibe that a wiki doesn't necessarily have, and it's got that kind of continuous conversations going, and you can get badges, and it's quite informal, but at the same time it's a huge repository of knowledge.
I think it's also got that show don't tell sort of attitude, whereas a lot of academic work is a sort of tell, this is how this is done, whereas a lot of programmers come from the background of well, show me it, see it sort of in action, whether that means like a big code script, or actually a link to something you can actually run. You can go to it, see it running in a little browser window, whether it's a roguelike generator in JavaScript or whatever it might be. That's the sort of thing that I think helps people gain access to that who may be working from a development point of view, but therefore are probably a bit more visual, in terms of they like to see the results there because they're working on projects that have those sort of results.
Yeah, and from a programming point of view, there's sites like Bitly and various other things that actually expose the code and the execution of that code within the same browser window, so that you can immediately play with the variables and get a feel for exactly how the systems are working. And there's a great presentation at I can't think of the guy's name, but it was at TED late last year, where he used an example of platforming to essentially dynamically change the parameters within the platforming game he was using to do things like have support rewinding time and reversal of gravity and various other games dynamically by just changing code on the left-hand side of the page. But it's a great example of that show don't tell kind of mechanism.
I was going to go up to because this since we're talking about the ways to try and get the academic world and the sort of independent world or the game production world to collaborate. One of the things I found, I don't know if this is the case anymore, but there was a situation where I wasn't part of the academic community, and yet I'd get invited to come to conferences and talk about my work, and then they would ask me to pay, and it was usually a reasonable amount of money, which seemed really unusual to me because I was used to being paid as an artist to go and talk. So someone would pay me to talk to an academic audience about my work. But the academic community, because it's quite kind of enclosed, you often have to pay to go and deliver a paper or pay to talk. And obviously, when you're in the community, you don't pay. Your faculty pays, your school pays. But that can put like a stop to people from outside of that getting involved, I think.
Just to be clear, the reason for that isn't that the academic community is enclosed. It's simply that the academic community is poor, and that's the mechanism that we have for paying for the rooms, the video projectors and stuff.
But I think it becomes a problem when you combine that with the lack of open access.
Absolutely.
Michael, you were talking about maybe having some sort of event or jam of getting academia and indies together.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this. I've been floating it around with people. So Tom had this idea that perhaps you could get academics to pair up with groups of developers temporarily and implement some of their ideas in like a proper game, across a 48-hour jam or a longer period of time. And I was talking to you about what if we could maybe have this jam where the only purpose was not to create games, but maybe to create smaller systems, tiny procedural systems that you could then release open source and people could use in future projects. So you build a system and its only purpose is to generate names for weapons. And you put that online and it's got a nice API and you release it for free forever. I think events where people code together are always good. They're tricky to organize. I don't know what the academics here feel like it, or what you and Andrew feel about it in terms of how roguelike developers would react. But I think Tom's right in that we need the independent community, or just game development at large, needs more ways to interact with academics. There are ways that exist, but I think the more avenues, the better.
Roguelike developers tend to be very lone wolfy, working alone, in whatever their preferred environment is, with their own engine that they've self-coded, that sort of thing. I imagine a lot of them would struggle to work with someone else to create something.
Painting a very romantic picture there.
Yeah. We're all a bit sad, you see. But as well as that, in the game jams that I've taken part in, when you pair up with people in teams, it's generally because one person's doing the coding and another person's doing the graphics, or something like that. It's rare to get a jam where people are coding together.
It's difficult. There was a great jam on TigSource where artists and musicians produced resources in one phase of the jam, and then in the second phase of the jam, coders took those resources and had to use them to make a game. Maybe we could encourage this mass open sourcing of systems with detailed documentation. You just set aside a few days where all you do is try and release an understandable, comprehensible version of something you've created. And then the second phase of that jam is that developers come along and pick those up and try and build games with them. Maybe it's infeasible. Maybe we're doomed to just gaze longingly at each other across the metaphorical party of the games industry.
Well, it's certainly worth a try, I think.
Yeah, I think that there are some academic papers that have been produced by some of the people talking here that would give some independent developers really inspiring kind of springboard to make something. And there's no reason why they couldn't work together on it's like if someone approached me with an idea that they'd proven in a paper that would generate a procedural platform level in a way that I thought was interesting and new, I'd be like, yeah, let's work together and not just prove the concept, but make it into a game that's fun to play, that's good, and that people will take on the level of being a game, not necessarily proof of concept. And I think that there's potential for that happening, which I think would be quite exciting to do. It's just trying to get those connections.
I can think of a couple of examples where something like that seems to at least been happening more recently, one of which is Gaslamp Games' Clockwork Empires, where a lot of that is being built on a procedural building generation system, which I think came out of an academic background / research paper to do with, I'm guessing, L systems. And they've gone off and partnered up with a guy who developed this paper originally and are now turning it into a, admittedly strategy game. But, and the other one I suspect is Sir, Are You Being Hunted? Where at least some procedural elements have, Sir, You Are Being Hunted, I think is the name of the game, isn't it?
Yeah,
or at least some procedural elements.
I'm working on that, so
yes,
yeah.
I really. My apologies if this has been brought up already.
I mean,
which is on Kickstarter. Just to bring that up again.
Yeah, pledge now.
I mean, it would be interesting to hear if you haven't discussed that already, how you got involved in that particular project.
No. I mean, I used to do a lot of kind of digital artwork that was involved me essentially hacking around with games and altering them, and then working with procedural software that I'd written. That was kind of half game but half demo scene sort of stuff, because there's a big connection with procedural generation and the demo scene. And I kind of came from that, and I ended up just getting in contact with some people who work, like Jim Rossignol, who's one of the editors for Rock Paper Shotgun, and we just sort of got on really well, and he'd always ask me if he needed some quotes about that kind of experimental artistic aspect of games. And then an opportunity came up for us to work together on this project, and he liked my experimental work, which was a lot was procedurally generated, and some of which came directly out of my academic research. And he thought we could essentially use it to produce something that would be an interesting game. And from my perspective, what's been really valuable about the whole experience is that I would never have given it the kind of cultural and narrative framework that he gave to it. The whole kind of thematic setting and the kind of backstory and the sort of style and tone of it all, which I think has been really useful and successful into getting people excited about it and firing up the kind of imagination around it. I don't think I would have been able to have come up with that. Whereas I was quite happy working with the sort of procedural generation stuff, which is slightly more from my academic research. So I think that's a good example of two kind of cultures working together on that sort of system. And I wouldn't claim that what I'm doing in it is revolutionary in terms of academic research. I don't think anything I've done in it is particularly new. Individually, all the elements have been done before. It's more just about putting them together to create a kind of cohesive whole that serves a slightly different kind of function, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. As a kind of outsider who's written about procedural generation, one observation I would make is that very little procedural generation, with except certainly in games, is particularly new. I don't think there's a huge amount of cutting edge stuff being done. But my argument would be that procedural generation in general is kind of not really pushed very hard, certainly in commercial games, from what I can see. People are doing the same old approach, which kind of serves certain things quite well. I mean, height field mappings and the kind of seed-based procedural generation, but they don't necessarily serve gameplay especially well.
Absolutely. And I think people would be surprised. Well, actually, I mean, so Leif, how complicated would you say? I mean, you said that there was sort of that your work was at AID was presented in a more complex fashion than it needed to be because you needed to demonstrate an awareness of these technologies. So how difficult would you say a system like yours with the constraint systems would be difficult to implement in your average roguelike from the ground up today?
Right. So having sort of gone through the process of sort of starting at ground zero and building something functional, if you sort of understand what's going on, it probably doesn't take very long. Maybe a weekend, maybe a week. Just sort of to
I
get
built the original version in a weekend.
Right. And so I'm really sort of a believer that it's not such a big deal to get something like this up and running in an actual game. And perhaps I think in the long term, the biggest time investment is going to be writing the descriptions of the problems that you're going to want to be able to solve, and not really writing the underlying fancy solver technology.
And constraint propagation is really flexible. Like, from what I know of it, it's got so many other applications as well that once you've implemented this idea, maybe it'll spread the developer's imagination elsewhere. And I think one of the really great benefits of academic work is that they can take a problem which has sort of stagnated for a while, and it can sort of unclog it. You can make this step forward, like this work that Leif and Ian presented a few weeks ago. And the the realization that actually, yeah, you can do it in a weekend if you sit down and you're willing to read up and maybe email around and ask about it. And once you've got over that hurdle, it might inspire you to produce systems on your own, and then suddenly the industry is pushing forward again in that area. Because I think you're right, Andrew. I think PCG isn't being pushed enough in the industry, but maybe there are papers out there that can kickstart certain areas and
There probably needs to be some commercial successes as well, though, doesn't there, for the industry to be bothered about it? I mean, if Diablo 3 sells X bazillion, then let's just do another Jigsaw roguelike dungeon generator because it's proven to work, and do they really need to do anything more? Might be the problem.
Absolutely. In fact, I think Torchlight 2 had less procedural generation in it than Torchlight 1 did, for what I can tell. But, one of the perceptions I have of the roguelike community is that they're kind of willing to experiment for the sake of it in some cases, which is a really great attitude to have.
Yeah, well, especially stuff with the 7-day roguelike challenges and things. And the nice thing about a roguelike is you can make it so quickly, and you don't worry too much about it. Well, you don't worry at all about it selling, usually. So you can play around with the mechanics alone in a very quick and easy way.
I think part of the reason that we're not seeing more commercial adoption of PCG, though, is it can be quite high risk. It's one of those things that you can't necessarily quantify putting a PCG system and what the actual return on it is going to be, because you are at such an arm's length from the actual output of whichever particular system you're using. And, there's been experiences where people have put in procedural systems. The only one I've seen written about is Pirates of the Burning Sea, where they put in procedural waves and a couple of other systems, and then it didn't, for a big investment of time, it just didn't work as a system. I think, that kind of risk-reward ratio, for what is an incredibly conservative industry as a whole, is the big reason that we're not seeing more adoption of PCG.
Yeah, that's true. So I work with evolutionary techniques, for instance, and the one thing about them is that you can never trust that they won't fail, really. They're the exact opposite of what people want when they think of a PCG system. Although, funnily enough, I think, I don't know whether Leif and Ian want to talk more about this, but I think constraint propagation is one of those interesting cases where actually you kind of do have some guarantees, because one of the things that you're saying is that the solution must have this in, or it must not have this in, never generate me a map where I can't reach the exit.
Right. That's the advantage of constraint propagation, is they really are constraints. However, the corresponding weakness is that you can't necessarily predict how long it will take it to find a solution. And so if you were building a system for a game, you would probably always want to be erring on the side of giving it easier problems so that you know that it will find the solutions in a timely manner.
And can it do this in real time? Or does that just depend on the complexity of the tasks?
I mean, it's probably very problem dependent. The example that we showed at AID did run in real time, and it ran very, very quickly. And, we were doing some sufficiently complex stuff, but it's pretty easy to sort of dream up a problem that it will sort of fail and thrash in.
Right.
I mean, speaking sort of very generally, what constraint propagation tasks are, or constraint satisfaction tasks are you have a bunch of choices that you're trying to make, like what kind of item do I put in each room in a level, and then you have some set of constraints on those choices. So, for example, I don't want there to be more than a certain number of health packs, or bosses can only be placed in choke points, things like that. And what you find is roughly, in a certain sense, that the amount of time that it takes to solve the problem is sort of determined by the ratio of the number of choices being made to the number of constraints. And when those get too finely balanced, then it's very hard to find solutions. And when but you can then make the problem easier oftentimes by just adding some extra rooms, for example, so that the system has more places to put monsters and so on, and that actually makes it an easier problem for the constraint solver.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds really interesting, because I guess you can build flexibility into that system, so you can make it, like you say, slightly more lax on its sort of determination to make it one single solution, or make it broader. So yeah, I mean, I could see the potential for something like that. Again, I guess it just has to go back to if it can be shown to be provable in a game. I mean, I'm not quite sure how successful it's been, but Spelunky does take a little bit of that approach, doesn't it? But I'm not quite sure whether they just use what I've often used, which is the spray and pray approach, which is just to say, well, if they need 8 of these things, well, let's put 10. Because if 2 of them are inaccessible, then we'll probably still be okay. So
Spelunky takes the approach that a few procedural games do, and I think works really well, which is you can always bomb your way into any solution.
Right.
So that, you can essentially, dig or tunnel your way out if, for whatever reason, the game hasn't generated a solution that is, in fact, solvable or easy. And so you get this quite interesting blend of what is, a system that's not necessarily provably correct with a resource constraint limitation. And that kind of fixes a lot of what could be otherwise quite, if you have a perfect game that is, everything's connected everywhere, and you're always going to have guaranteed sufficient resource to be able to win a particular game, I think the risk you run is it could almost be a bit boring. Whereas if you do have this kind of interesting interplay between resource constraints that is forced on the player, where they are never able to completely come up with an optimal solution, they're kind of always second-guessing things and always trying to work against a system that is, to an extent, unfair. It makes for a much more interesting game.
So how does that gel with the roguelike philosophy? Because if I know...
Well, that is the roguelike philosophy. That is that is blatantly... rogue gets blatantly unfair in the deepest parts of the dungeon.
That was what I wanted to ask you. So some runs are kind of... Some games are sort of dependent on, I may not be able to finish this game. Whereas others are kind of, we guarantee you can always get through. Are there any roguelikes that take that latter approach?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Generally, the more traditional roguelikes depend a lot more on. Take combat for instance. You're up against an enemy, and your attacks do 1d6 damage, and you've got a 70% chance of hit. So you can quite easily have a string of dice rolls that you will die in. That's sort of the traditional roguelike approach, but I think that especially modern roguelikes are much less relying on random mechanics like that, and the same philosophy transfers through to the dungeon levels, and making sure everything's connected up, making sure you can access all content and all challenges can, with correct preparation and correct tactics, be completed. Yeah. All of my roguelikes are like that.
I'm interested in that as well, because I was playing FTL the other day, and I got to one of the galaxy maps, and I went forward like 3 or 4 systems, and then it turned out that the network of systems in that I couldn't go across the bottom of the map. I had to go all the way back and then up and then along the top to get out, and it was just impossible, because by that point the kind of danger zone had crept along. So I was actually thinking, would this ever have been possible?
In FTL, they've recently added a thing so you can hover over maps to see which points they're connected to. But I have seen some shots of it where there's been disconnected parts of maps, so they've obviously not got their flood fill or whatever quite right, I think. Most roguelikes, though, ensure that dungeons are connected.
Because the paper that you have written, Ian and Leif, is essentially trying to guarantee that those situations won't occur, isn't it?
Right.
In terms of connectivity, things have improved significantly. But taking Brogue is a good example, where it guarantees at the starter level that everything's connected, and it also generates what these things called machine rooms, which might be essentially some kind of lock and key puzzle where you might have to, there'll be a potion of fire resistance placed on the level and a section of lava that you have to cross to get the reward. And at that point it's guaranteed, but because a pit bloat, which is a particular monster, is generated next to the potion of fire resistance, and you or you accidentally drink it when you're too far away from the lava, or there's a monster that's too powerful between you and the potion in order to be able to get across the lava. These things that you have to then kind of conserve your resources or decide to spend other resources in the game may constrain your ability to actually get to the particular reward. And the developer has blatantly basically said, once you get to level 20 in the dungeon, the game is designed that every single situation you get into could possibly kill you. And that's the way Broke is interesting. Whereas if it was easier, I don't think it would necessarily make for as interesting a game.
So what you've just described feels inherently roguelike-y and interesting and fun, for that capital F fun, I guess. But let me ask you and Darren whether, like from our perspective as academics, do you feel like there's something about roguelikes? There are topics which are not really features of roguelikes, they're just problems that can't be solved. Because I was reading the Berlin definition of what a roguelike was, I think, on the wiki recently. And under the narrative section it said that one of the features of a roguelike was that it generally didn't have a narrative. But then it said that the reason for it was...
That whole thing is shit.
Okay, fair enough. So I was interested because... There's a section where it basically says that the reason roguelikes don't have narratives is because it's too hard to do. So I'm interested whether you think there are features of roguelikes that are part of their appeal, or whether they're a part of sort of roadblocks that haven't been pushed past next.
Well, that particular one is... that's complete bollocks. God. There's a lot of people trying to do narrative roguelikes. Tome 4, which I do writing for, has about a sixth the amount of narrative text in it as Skyrim does, mostly from my own hand. There's others which have procedural quest systems and all sorts. But traditionally, a lot of roguelikes don't have stories or have very, very, very basic stories, simply because that's not the focus of the game. They don't have stories for the same reason they don't have graphics. That's not what the developer is interested in. That's not what the players are interested in. Yeah, the Berlin interpretation I consider to be immensely outdated. It was put together a number of years ago, and roguelikes have changed significantly since then.
There's also a point to be made that, narrative is probably one of those problems that's going to be, immeasurably hard to solve in many ways. Or it's going to be one of those things that we suddenly discover, hey, well, we can actually solve it using some kind of statistical approach where we just string enough things together that it looks like an actual story is being told, and people aren't able to really recognize the difference between something that's, driven to be close enough to what looks like an actual proper narrative versus an actual proper narrative. Spelunky is a great example of that. You might have a skull generated in front of an arrow trap, and that immediately, those two things immediately suggest some kind of backstory or vignette. And, narrative in games is more effective in those kind of suggestive mechanisms rather than having a talking head telling you where you have to go next. So, narrative in games isn't necessarily a well understood or solved problem in itself, let alone trying to talk about narrative in a roguelike.
There's a paper called Towards Supporting Stories with Procedurally Generated Game Worlds, which kind of tries to deal with it by sort of doing a similar process to the level propagation system, but much kind of cruder, by placing kind of plot-based elements in kind of stages throughout the game, so that if you need this encounter to occur in a forest, then the forest should be generated at this point in the game, so that the access to them is sort of there's a sort of flow that goes through them. So it's more about generating plot points that occur at different intervals through the game, which I think I was asking on Twitter about the other day, is like, are there any roguelikes that are conscious of what's happened in the previous level of the dungeon, and therefore will produce another encounter with a character that you've met before. But that will only happen if you have encountered them, if you see what I mean. Because obviously that's an interesting kind of aspect.
I think that's certainly an area for more exploration in general, because roguelikes haven't bothered with story. It's not an area that has been concentrated on greatly. The concentration is always on the combat mechanics or the RPG mechanics or something similar. So I definitely think there's the scope for that to be developed a lot more. The only game I can think of that has anything like that is Gearhead, which has a procedural quest system, which kind of has a 50-50 chance of producing something sensible or not. But it's got an interesting system anyway. And we were discussing with Tarn Adams, the maker of Dwarf Fortress, recently about this whole problem of exposition in games, and it's very hard to get good exposition from an AI. There's all sorts of work going on that elsewhere of trying to make AIs that can sort of fool a human into thinking it's not an AI. And trying to include that in a game would be a lot of work, whereas these light touches of just giving little bits of information, the player can kind of construct the narrative in his head, and the computer can design plot points, little points on a map, as it were, without having to give the whole big, long exposition, long dialogue, or anything like that.
I've also argued on my blog that a lot of kind of traditional narrative techniques, like having quests and quest givers, could be replaced by a more effective and more interesting systemic approach. For instance, having a trading subsystem in a particular game where you naturally want to go to a particular place because it's easier or cheaper or produces better goods, would have the same kind of effect as having to, go between quest givers, but provide much more interesting gameplay and much more intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation for the player anyway. So I'm not particularly won over by a narrative-based approach to, even a procedurally generated narrative-based approach to moving a gameplay forward.
It's funny because, as you note, we're still really trying to work out how a lot of these aspects of game development should work at the same time that we've got academics trying to automate how humans do them now. So you've got, as you say, like game narrative. We're not really sure how game narrative should be conveyed, but at the same time we've got people who want to sort of produce systems that can work under our current understanding, even though that's changing all the time. It's very difficult. It's very fast moving.
Yeah. But one of the things is it can contribute to it. If you make a system that, the lovely thing about procedurally generated stuff is that you will get things that you didn't expect. So, with whatever work we do, we can end up with things that surprise us. Rogue itself was the sort of first of its kind. I think a lot of games that we've seen since, although they've not included procedural element, took pointers from it and some of the natural interactions that you got from that. And I think we can see a lot of that from AI development and further procedural content development.
I think part of the problem is as well, there's a real kind of skills gap in that when you start looking at a particular procedural system, it starts suggesting further problems that you need to look at. That if you haven't invested time in that particular procedural system, you just won't understand or won't kind of recognize as issues. And so, the kind of language and thinking about a particular system like a constraints-based system or a generative system of some kind, there's almost not enough people working on any particular problem to really start to have a conversation about how that, how the solution space they're working in actually then has consequences elsewhere within game development or within kind of academia as well. Or am I not correct in saying that?
I agree with you there. I think, especially if you're not used to dealing with procedural content, the whole system from the outside seems scary. And a lot of procedural content stuff does actually get quite complex, and it involves a lot of thinking through things, a lot more than just hand designing a level or hand designing some content. Trying to make something which makes something is a lot harder than making something. So I think that probably made less sense. we're quite over time actually. So just looking to wrap up, just wondering if anyone had any final thoughts.
Well, I think we'd all like to get communities like the roguelike community closer to our work, and vice versa. And so we didn't come to many grand conclusions in this episode, but I'm sure all of us are open for contacts with developers. We'd love people to get in touch with us, read our work, ask for papers that they can't find or whatever. And yeah, hopefully we can do the same. Hopefully we can start working towards you guys as well.
Cool.
Has anyone brought up the procedural content generation Google group as a possible place to start having those conversations?
Do people still use Google Groups?
I would hope so. Is
that the one? Is that the PCG one? Is it just?
Yeah. That's the one that Julia Tagilis got started, which it's a relatively low traffic thread at this point in time.
Yeah.
But I'm probably about once a month I get some master's student emailing me asking for advice on what they should be doing their thesis on. And that's the place I've been directing them to at least start asking questions, because I'm probably not the best person to talk to about that. We'll put a link to that at the bottom of the podcast. I don't think it's on Usenet. It's actually just a Google group.
All right, okay.
But, there's also this kind of, where do you have these conversations in a community, not just a one-to-one kind of channel. And, with the death of Usenet, and the very low traffic rec game roguelike development forum, Usenet group. Where do you go these days? TIG Source?
There's some procedural discussion goes on at Rogue Temple. There's sort of somewhat regular threads, but they often get derailed by
Christ?
Yeah. They often get derailed by side discussions and things. It's hard to actually have a good, proper coding talk there, which doesn't send into arguments. So yeah, there isn't a great place to go really to talk about procedural generation at the moment, I don't think. I'll have to check out this Google group.
Other than the comments of this podcast, of course, which is going to be filled with discussion and grand designs. And I'm sure everyone on the podcast will be getting involved in the thread as well.
Well, I'm going to wrap up now, but just actually, I suppose on the topic of communities, is there a way that academics keep in touch with each other about these sorts of things, or is it just going to conferences and stuff?
Well, I was going to say there is a Mendeley group. Mendeley is this open source bibliography database program, and it's sort of like EndNote meets Facebook somehow, and so it does social networking, and so they have groups, and I think it's Jim Whitehead at UC Santa Cruz who curates a PCG Mendeley group, and so there's a big database of papers on PCG there, and you could include that also.
I suppose the other thing to note is that there are events at academic institutions now and then, conferences and such. I know Imperial, Michael, you're involved in organising the game event each year.
Absolutely. We had a really great event this year. It's been getting better every year. It's around May, and we don't publish it too widely. We don't advertise it, but it is absolutely open to the public. And I'll be starting arrangements for this year's soon, for next year's rather.
Cool. I only found out about it because I was working at Imperial when it came up, and I was like, "Oh, I'm going to go to that."
That's how well we advertise.
But yeah, I keep noticing things after the fact, or at other universities like Surrey and stuff like that. I'd say for anyone listening, if you're interested in sort of going to academic events, look out at sort of universities near you, see if they've got things going on. Maybe try and get in touch with people. Most academics are pretty friendly, as you guys here are. But yeah, there's a lot of sort of people out there working on stuff that in the shadows of it, and I think they always appreciate the chance to sort of talk about it a bit more. Yeah,
I think most of us really do. Most of us love talking to people about this stuff.
Yeah, and I would be, happy if anybody has any questions about how to implement the stuff that Leif and I did in our system, I'd be happy to work with people and help them out. I've been intending to do a reference implementation to show to people anyway.
Okay, cool. I'm quite interested in that for a particular game, actually, which I think could benefit quite well from using a very similar system.
Cool.
So it'd be quite nice to be in touch about that.
Okay.
Cool. All right, well, I think that's it for this week. Next week, we are going to be talking about strategy games. Is that right, Andrew?
Yes. We're changing the name of the podcast and getting on a new presenter.
Changing the genre every year. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're having one of our rivals on the show to talk about a sort of crossover genre. So any fans of 3 Moves Ahead might also like next week's episode. Okay, but that's it for this week. Goodbye, folks.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Take care.